March 1867, Russia, battered by war debts and staring down British expansion from Canada, secretly arranges a midnight gamble, selling Alaska to the United States for pennies an acre. What would drive a superpower to give away a vast landmass it could barely defend? The story behind why did Russia practically give away Alaska isn't just about desperation. It's a cautionary tale of imperial panic, hasty decisions, and consequences that echo through history. How close did this deal come to disaster? And what did Russia truly lose? By the 1850s, the Russian Empire's Arctic ambitions were running on empty. The fur trade, once the backbone of Russian America, had collapsed under the pressure of overhunting and changing fashion in Europe. Sea otter pelts, which had lured Russian ships across the Pacific, now fetched a fraction of their former price. Company ledgers from the Russian-American Company tell the story in numbers. Profits from furs had plummeted more than 60% in a single generation. What was once a lucrative colonial outpost was now a financial sinkhole, swallowing subsidies from St. Petersburg year after year. The numbers only got worse after the Crimean War. Defeat at the hands of Britain and France left Russia's treasury in shambles. War bonds came due, but the imperial budget was already stretched thin by the cost of rebuilding the army and navy. Finance ministers issued bleak reports. One described Alaska as an outlay without return. Every ruble sent to Sitka was a ruble not spent on railroads across Siberia or the new Amur territories in the Far East. The Tsar's government faced a stack of unpaid debts, and the costs of maintaining Alaska, supplies, garrisons, bribes to keep the peace, kept rising. Railway projects at home demanded huge investments. After the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, the state owed compensation to the nobility, further draining the treasury. Alaska, thousands of miles from the capital, offered little hope of turning a profit. The Russian-American Company begged for new subsidies, warning that without support they would have to abandon their posts. Reports from the colony painted a grim picture. Dwindling fur returns, disgruntled workers, and growing unrest among indigenous communities. Attempts to diversify, mining, fishing, logging, failed to fill the gap. Shipping food and supplies across the Pacific was a logistical nightmare, and the colony's few exports barely covered the cost of transport. Within government circles, frustration boiled over. Grand Duke Constantine, the Tsar's brother, pressed for liquidation, arguing that the empire could not afford to keep pouring money into a frozen backwater. Finance Ministry memoranda warned that in the event of another war, Alaska would be lost to Britain anyway, with no compensation. The mood inside the Winter Palace was one of resignation. Alaska had become a liability, too expensive to defend, impossible to develop, and a growing embarrassment on the imperial balance sheet. By the mid-1860s, the question was no longer whether to keep Alaska, but how to cut losses before the next crisis hit. The empire's financial managers, staring at red ink and unpaid bills, began quietly searching for a way out. Grand Duke Constantine gathered the Tsar's closest advisors in the Winter Palace on December 16, 1866. The council's transcripts read like a ledger of hard choices. Military attachés warned that Alaska could not be defended if Britain came south from Canada. Finance ministers pointed to the colony's rising costs and the empire's empty coffers. The shadow of the Crimean War hung over every calculation. British gunboats had already shelled the Russian Far East once, and no one doubted they could do it again. Naval assessments made clear that sending reinforcements across the Pacific was a fantasy. If another conflict erupted, Alaska would fall to the British before a single Russian ship could cross the ocean. Konstantin pressed the point. He argued that selling Alaska was not surrender, but strategy. If the territory was doomed to be lost in the next war, better to choose the terms and the buyer. The United States, still battered from its own civil war, posed no immediate threat to Russian interests. In fact, American expansion might serve as a buffer, checking British ambitions in the Pacific. The precedent of Fort Ross, sold off to John Sutter in California back in 1841, sat fresh in the imperial memory. That outpost, stripped of value and impossible to defend, had been quietly liquidated before it could become a British prize. The lesson was clear. When the writing is on the wall, it's better to sell than to lose everything for nothing. After hours of debate, the council reached consensus. Tsar Alexander II authorized the sale. The minimum acceptable price was set at $5 million, but Stuckel was encouraged to push for more. The Foreign Ministry dispatched coded instructions to Washington, and Eduard de Stuckel, Russia's minister to the United States, was given his mandate. His orders: negotiate discreetly, keep the British in the dark, and secure the best terms possible. The stakes were not just financial but geopolitical, the future of Russian influence in the Pacific and the balance of power in North America. Stuckel understood the urgency. He packed his bags and left for Washington, carrying secret instructions and the weight of imperial expectations. In his briefcase, alongside drafts of the negotiating brief, were the latest risk assessments from the Admiralty. Every page warned of British designs on Alaska and the impossibility of defending it from St. Petersburg. The sale was no longer just a way out of a bad investment. It was a move to deny Britain a foothold on the continent. If Alaska had to go, better it go to the Americans, even at a discount. With the decision made, the machinery of diplomacy lurched into motion. Stuckel would soon find himself at the heart of a midnight negotiation, bargaining over the fate of 500,000 square miles. But in the halls of the Winter Palace, the sense was one of grim relief. Russia had chosen its exit, not out of optimism, but out of cold calculation. The empire would cut its losses, cash the check, and hope history would judge the decision as shrewd, not desperate. Eduard de Stuckel arrived at William Seward's house in the dead of night, clutching the fate of Alaska in his satchel. The hour was past 3 when the Russian diplomat knocked on the door, still flushed from the telegram that had just arrived from St. Petersburg. Tsar Alexander II's final approval had come through. Seward, roused from sleep, didn't hesitate. Why wait till tomorrow? Let's make the treaty tonight. The two men settled at a table lit by flickering candles. Stuckel, his nerves sharpened by months of pressure from the Winter Palace and the looming shadow of British ambitions, pushed for the highest price he could defend. Seward, ever the expansionist, saw opportunity measured in square miles, not just dollars. The bargaining, so often drawn out over weeks in diplomatic circles, collapsed into a single breathless sprint. By 4 a.m., pens scratched across parchment. The agreement, 586,412 square miles, more than twice the size of Texas, would change hands for $7.2 million. The math was almost laughable. About 2 cents an acre for a landmass that spanned glaciers, forests, and untold resources. The treaty, signed in the soft glow of candlelight, was more than a document. It was a lifeline for a bankrupt empire and a gamble for a restless republic. Stuckel's hand shook as he scrawled his name, not just from fatigue, but from the weight of history. Seward's signature followed, steady and bold. The room, thick with the scent of wax and ink, bore witness to a transaction that would redraw maps and fortunes. A check was written, one of the largest ever issued by the US Treasury at that time. $7.2 million, made out to Edward de Stockel, Russian minister. The warrant itself, stamped and sealed, would become an artifact of American expansion. In today's terms, it amounted to roughly $150 million, but in 1867, it was a staggering sum for a nation still healing from civil war. The check was more than payment. It was the physical proof that, overnight, the United States had bought a fifth of its future. The ink was barely dry when news began to leak. But at that moment, as dawn crept over Washington, the deal was done. The Russians had locked in the terms before second thoughts or rival bidders could intervene. For Stockel, relief mingled with exhaustion. For Seward, the real battle was just beginning. He would soon face a storm of ridicule and outrage from Congress and the press. But in that quiet, breathless hour, two men had turned a continent's destiny with a flick of the pen and a midnight check. Ridicule swept across the United States as news of the Alaska deal hit the papers. Cartoonists had a field day. Seward's icebox, Walrussia, the polar bear garden, each nickname sharper than the last. Editorials painted the purchase as a national embarrassment, a frozen wasteland bought with money better spent elsewhere. In Congress, the laughter quickly turned to resistance. Lawmakers scoffed at the idea of spending millions on what they called an Arctic desert, and the House refused to release a single dollar for the treaty. The mood in Washington was poisonous. Edward de Stockel, the Russian minister, found himself fighting a battle on two fronts. On one side, the Tsar's court pressed for quick payment. On the other, American politicians stalled and sniped. Stockel's answer was blunt. Open the checkbook. His embassy ledgers, later pored over by historians, reveal more than $200,000 spent on miscellaneous expenses, a polite term for bribes and lobbying. Senators, congressmen, and influential journalists received quiet gifts or promises. Stockel later wrote to St. Petersburg, complaining the campaign had left him nearly broke. Money alone wasn't enough. The turning point came with Charles Sumner, the powerful Massachusetts senator. In a packed chamber, Sumner spoke for 3 hours, wielding a stack of statistics and a flair for drama. He described Alaska's fisheries, its forests, its minerals, resources that, he insisted, would one day repay the nation many times over. He painted a picture of American ships sailing the Pacific, fueled by Alaskan timber and protected by outposts along a new northern frontier. His speech, printed in full in the Congressional Record, swayed doubters and shifted the mood in the Capitol. Yet, even as debate raged, the treaty's text quietly excluded Alaska's original inhabitants. Article 3 labeled Native Alaskans as uncivilized tribes, denying them citizenship and leaving their future to the whims of US policy. Their voices were absent from the halls of Congress, their fate decided by men who had never set foot on their land. The final vote was anything but certain. When the tally came down, 113 in favor, 43 against, it was a narrow victory for Seward and Stockel. The check was sent, and the deal became irreversible. But the sense of farce lingered. At the official handover in Sitka, the Russian flag tangled and refused to come down, flapping stubbornly until a soldier cut it free with a bayonet. Some called it an omen. Others just shook their heads. The ink was dry, the money spent, and a continent's future had been sold for the price of a city block. Gold fever swept through Alaska in the 1890s, turning a territory once mocked as a national punchline into a magnet for fortune seekers. The Klondike and Nome gold rushes drew tens of thousands of prospectors north, their dreams fueled by rumors of easy riches. In a matter of years, the gold fields churned out millions of dollars, lining the pockets of miners, merchants, and the US Treasury. By some estimates, over $1 billion worth of gold was pulled from Alaskan soil before the rushes faded, enough to repay the purchase price hundreds of times over. But gold was only the opening act. In the 20th century, oil men arrived with seismic surveys and drilling rigs, tapping into reserves that would reshape America's energy future. The discovery of the Prudhoe Bay oil field in 1968 unleashed a new bonanza. Since statehood in 1959, Alaska has produced more than 17 billion barrels of oil. Revenue from oil alone has topped $180 billion, with over 1 billion barrels still underground, waiting to be pumped. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, snaking 800 miles from the Arctic to the Gulf of Alaska, became a symbol of resource wealth that dwarfed anything Seward or Stuckel could have imagined. And the riches aren't just buried underground. Alaska's rivers and lakes hold more surface water than any other US state, an abundance that would make any modern government salivate, even if it falls far short of the legendary 10% of the world's fresh water. For Russia, the sale that once looked like a shrewd escape now reads like a cautionary tale. A land traded for quick cash, only to see its true value explode in gold, oil, and untapped resources. Alaska's true weight on the world stage was measured not just in gold or oil, but in its power to shape global conflict. In June 1942, Japanese forces landed on the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, making Alaska the only part of the United States occupied by enemy troops during World War II. For months, American soldiers fought across frozen ridges and fog-bound beaches to reclaim the islands. Military dispatches called the Aleutians the Forgotten Front, but generals saw something else. A critical outpost on the edge of the Pacific, where the hemisphere's fate could turn on a handful of icy rocks. That lesson wasn't forgotten. When the Cold War dawned, Alaska became the front line of a new kind of standoff. The US military built radar stations and airfields stretching from Nome to the Arctic Circle, watching the skies for Soviet bombers that could cross the pole in hours. On a clear day, the distance between Big Diomede in Russia and Little Diomede in the US is only 2.4 miles, close enough for villagers to shout across the water, but separated by the invisible wall of superpower rivalry. Classified files from both sides show how planners mapped out every mile of the Bering Strait, calculating how quickly missiles or planes could reach Seattle, Anchorage, or even Moscow. Today, as climate change thins the Arctic ice, Alaska's strategic value is rising once again. New sea routes are opening between Asia and Europe, and nations are racing to claim shipping lanes and untapped resources. The same territory once dismissed as a frozen afterthought now sits at the center of global competition, proof that, in geopolitics, yesterday's wasteland can become tomorrow's prize. When the United States signed a $7.2 million check in 1867, it acquired 586,412 square miles of what many called a frozen wasteland. Russian treasury records and council minutes confirm the decision was driven by post-Crimean War debt and fears of losing Alaska to Britain without compensation. Congressional transcripts show the deal nearly collapsed, surviving only after $200,000 in lobbying and a narrow 113-43 vote. The treaty's text excluded Alaska's indigenous peoples from consultation or citizenship. Decades later, gold, oil, and military bases transformed Alaska into a strategic and economic powerhouse. Over $180 billion in oil alone since 1959. Some documents about political pressure and internal Russian debate remain sealed in archives. Today, Alaska's resources and position still shape US-Russia rivalry and Arctic policy. The evidence is clear. A short-term calculation changed the fate of two nations, and the true value of Alaska was only revealed by time.